So we're live in 5 seconds. So hello and welcome to tonight's online lecture. My name is Mattias Enström and I'm a curator and marketer at the Studio Museum Bror Hjorth's hus in Uppsala. And this lecture is held in Zoom, streamed to YouTube. Oh, sorry, technical issues. You don't need to hear me like 2 times. So I'll restart by saying hello again and welcome to tonight's online lecture. So I am Mattias Enström and I'm a curator and marketer at the Studio Museum Bror Hjorth's hus in Uppsala, Sweden. And this lecture is held in Zoom and live streamed to YouTube. And we have members of the Museum's Friends Association here in Zoom, and they have the opportunity to ask questions directly or via the chat in Zoom. And other viewers, you are welcome to post questions in the chat on YouTube. But please note that there's about a 20 to 30 second delay between Zoom and YouTube. So right now I'm sitting in the studio where Bror Hjorth worked for the last 25 years of his life until his death in 1968. And I'm surrounded by many of his sculptures, paintings and reliefs. But tonight we are going back in time, almost 100 years, to visit another of Bror Hjorth's studios. Like so many other artists from around the world, Bror Hjorth traveled to Paris to become an artist. And he arrived in 1921 and enrolled as a student in sculpture in Antoine Baudel's class at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière in Montparnasse. And a fellow student was Alberto Giacometti, for whom Bror Hjorth expressed huge admiration, both when he was a student, but especially he admired his later works. Except for 2 drawings by Bror Hjorth, portraying Giacometti, there's not much to suggest that they had more than marginal contact with each other. But it so happened that they came to share the same address, though not at the same time. The number 46, rue Hippolyte Maindron, which is now famous because it became Giacometti's iconic studio for 40 years, and as such, one of the key spaces of 20th century art. I have been there myself a couple of times, traveling in Bror Hjorth's footsteps and visiting the famous Montparnasse cafes and bars, the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, where you can still do croquis in the afternoon, and some of the places he stayed and worked in. And while lurking outside the Hippolyte address one day, the owner came home. And my wife politely told him in French, as I don't speak French, that we were following the footstep of this Swedish artist and asked if we could have a short look at the alley behind his front door. He was very reluctant and told us off and said that no Swedish artist has lived here, only Giacometti. And then he closed the door behind him. But as you will see and hear in this lecture, a lot of artists from different countries lived in the studio complex on the rue Hippolyte. This pandemic that we're in right now is keeping us apart, but in some ways it might just have brought us a little closer to each other. The experience of online meetings has certainly made it much easier to invite speakers from more distant places than before. And today's speaker is sitting in the Netherlands. So let's all cross our fingers and hopefully the technology will work with us tonight. It's with great pleasure that I welcome tonight's speaker, James Newton Chadwick, researcher and biographer of the studio complex on the rue Hippolyte Maindron. And I am really so glad to have you with us, James. And with that, I will leave the show to you now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Matthias. It's very kind of you to invite me. With all the strange things that are happening at the moment, I've kind of been dreaming of visiting the Bror Hjorth house in person one day, and that'll be the first thing that the first adventure that I want to have once all of this is over. So I think I'll share my screen if that's possible, and I can show you a few photographs of the studio complex. So let's see. Okay, so do you see what I'm seeing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see some nodding. That's positive news. So, so Matthias, as you mentioned, I'm an author and researcher, and I'm writing a book about the studio complex at the corner of the rue Hippolyte Maindron and the rue du Moulin Vert in Paris. So this is, as you said, where Giacometti spent 40 years of his life. It's sort of in this really almost unremarkable corner of Paris. You mentioned that you've met it, that you'd visited it. It's quite a sleepy neighborhood where nothing seems to happen. But nonetheless, this one tiny corner at the corner of these two streets, I've discovered that they were home to so many interesting stories of the art from the past. So you've got to imagine sort of like studio parties attended by Gertrude Stein and Picasso. In the early 1930s, several key members of the Surrealist group lived at this particular studio complex, as well as a surreal pet lemur as well at this time. You could also make a reasonable argument that this was the place where the Tachist movement was born, thanks to an experiment done by the Danish artist Asger Jorn. Now, as you already mentioned, this was also the place where from 1923 until 1926, Bror Hjorth lived. But, sort of to go back a little bit onto what you said, you also mentioned that Giacometti lived there and had his studio for 39 years or 40 years. So in these two photographs, you can see, you can maybe just about make out that, this sloping building behind Bror Hjorth in the photograph that you saw at the beginning there is the same sloping roof of the studio just here, which is Giacometti's own studio. So he arrived, Giacometti that is, he arrived in the winter of 1926 to this rather ramshackle collection of studios. And he lived and worked in this sort of cave-like studio. It's a place without running water or electricity. He originally slept in the same room that he had all of his painting equipment and did all of his sculptures. And, once Giacometti became a very famous artist, and people saw that he hadn't moved from this quite rudimentary location, I think people started to find it quite fascinating that such a successful man would choose to live in such an unusual place. And actually, I mentioned sort of like in the late 40s and 50s and early 60s, when Giacometti was, a world famous artist, you had, who you might call the humanist photographers like Sabine Weiss, Cartier-Bresson, Brassai, Robert Doisneau visit Giacometti and take photographs and photo essays of him in this context. It's hard to think of another artist other than Giacometti who is so linked, when you picture him in his studio. So this is a very iconic address. As Matthias, I think you quoted, there's an art critic named Michael Pepiat who wrote a book called In Giacometti's Studio, in which he called it one of the key spaces of 20th century art. And not only, I think, for people who have a serious interest in art, these particular photographs, this one by Alexander Lieberman, this photo essay was published in Vogue magazine. This was Giacometti, the superstar in his famous studio. However, as Matthias sort of said at the beginning, there were other artists who lived in the studio complex. And as far as I could see when I started researching what was happening there, you know, this focus on Giacometti at 46 rue Hippolyte Maindron not only kind of overshadows the other artists, but also sort of conceals their stories as well. So if you look at these photographs, you know, this was from a time late in Giacometti's career when actually he had begun to rent, you know, with his brother Diego and his wife Annette, you know, many of the different studios in the complex. You don't see any other artists there. You don't see the life of the studio as it used to be. You know, from, you know, 1916 until, you know, well into the mid 20th century, there were lots of other artists who were living here and working here in close proximity. So what I'd actually like to do over the course of this talk is to, like, you know, sort of give you a virtual tour of this studio complex at a time before Giacometti. Okay, so before Giacometti arrived, you know, a couple of months after Bror Hjorth himself had left. But I'd like to show you the studios, you know, take you around the complex, show you some photographs of each of the individual rooms, and introduce you to the artists who were living there at the same time as Bror Hjorth. You know, the people that he would have passed in the street, the people he would have, you know, seen on his day-to-day life, let's say. And, you know, in clockwise order, let's say from this photograph of Hjorth himself in his studio on the rue Hippolyte Maindron, these artists will be the Russian painters Ivan Pooney and Cassenia Bogustavskaya, who before the revolution were very close to Tatlin and to Mayakovsky, but then went on, you know, in the 40s and the 50s to become very, very related to the School of Paris. You have another artist couple just here who are called Theo and Nelly Van Dusberg, who were Dutch artists associated with the Stijl movement. And then lastly, you have Jean Fautrier, who Hjorth mentions in his autobiography, in fact, as being another inhabitant of the studio complex, who became, you know, very well known after the Second World War as one of the leading proponents of Thatcherism and also of l'art informel, but, you know, had a completely different style, which I'll show you a bit later on when I introduce you to his studio later. So to start off with, this is the entirety of the studio complex. So this is the Franco-Swedish artist Gustav Bolin, who lived in the studio complex from the occupation until 1999. But I've just taken this photograph because it's one of the rare ones which actually shows you the studio complex in its entirety. So on the left-hand side of the painting, you can see just about this narrow alleyway, which is very famous from the photographs of Giacometti. But you can see that the whole studio complex is actually a little bit larger. So it's roughly 660 meters squared. It's mostly a garden around the center. And I've called it, because it has no name, I've called it Pierre-Ernest Charéron's studio complex, because although he wasn't the person who built the original studios of this complex, he was the person who built Giacometti's studio and Bror Hjorth's studio, and who, you know, developed the rest of it into one single unit. I also particularly like this photograph because it shows you that it is at the corner of two streets, right? So you can see the sign for the rue Hippolyte Maindron, or the rue Hippolyte as the studio, as the artists of the studio used to call it. But then up here you have the rue du Moulin Vert. So this complex actually had, you know, quite a few different entrances, but confusingly two addresses. So you have on the left-hand side 46 rue Hippolyte Maindron, and on the right-hand side you have 51 rue du Moulin Vert. And I will start with the inhabitants in 1923 of those studios at 51 rue du Moulin Vert, who were Van Doesburg couple, who I mentioned already. Now, Matthias mentioned at the beginning, I'm coming to you from the Netherlands, and these people are actually very, very famous in Holland. Theo van Doesburg was the editor of the Stijl periodical, which he claimed was the only avant-garde periodical in the Netherlands. And you might be familiar with the work of de Stijl, particularly through the painter Piet Mondrian, who was a colleague and associate of the Van Doesburgs. So Mondrian's design was the design that went towards this very famous dress that you might have seen before. But this painting, which is quite similar, you might say, is the work of Van Doesburg. Now, Nelly Van Dusberg, she came from a very Catholic, very comfortable upper middle class background in Den Haag, in The Hague. And she had met Van Doesburg 3 years previously in 1920. And her quite conservative parents were not exactly very happy about this situation at all. So they didn't like Van Doesburg for several reasons. Firstly, because he was a Protestant. Secondly, he was divorced 2 times. And thirdly, he was 16 years older than Nelly was. And lastly, and perhaps worst of all, he was an artist. And they'd always feared that Nelly would end up marrying an impoverished artist, And so serious was the situation judged, actually, that according to Nelly, a solution was found, which was that every copy of De Stijl, the periodical edited by Van Doesburg, was thrown on the family fireplace. And after dinner, all of Nelly's large family would gather together and say a prayer for the salvation of her soul. And in the long term, it was sort of decided that Nelly would go and stay on a convent on the Isle of Wight. And she had very different ideas about this situation. And so when the ultimatum was finally delivered, you can either have Van Doesburg or you can have your family. Nelly left without even packing her bags. And the Van Doesburg couple went on this sort of endless adventure around Europe. They met Marinetti, the leader of the Futurists in Italy. They went and saw Tristan Tzara in Paris to see, to talk about Dadaism. They ended up living in Weimar, close to Gropius's Bauhaus, where Van Doesburg wanted to get a job. They shared a studio with the filmmaker Hans Richter in Berlin. And then, as I mentioned, in 1923, at the end of April, they arrived in Paris. And they stayed with Piet Mondrian, who is this guy with the fetching moustache in the photograph you can see. This is Nelly and Mondrian in 1923 in the studio of the rue du Départ, which is where they were staying at the time. And the idea was that they wanted to put in motion all the necessary arrangements for an exhibition on the architecture of De Stijl that Theo had been asked to give by the art dealer Léonce Rosenberg at his Galerie de l'Effort Moderne. And the initial idea was to sort of organize this with Mondrian and hopefully get his involvement and then move on to go on holiday to Italy with Tristan Tzara and a few others. But they decided they liked Paris so much that they wanted to stay until mid-October when the exhibition actually happened. And so as Nelly says, it was approximately late spring when we arrived in Paris. And it wasn't long before we found an atelier on the rue du Moulin Vert in a studio complex where later Giacometti was to have his studio. So this photograph I'm showing you, this isn't actually the Van Doesburgs. This was a photograph taken later, but the doorway that you see that's open, this was the doorway to the Van Doesburg studio. This, big atelier window that you see here at 51 rue du Moulin Vert. And we can see the inside as well. So this is Theo and Nelly, at the window that you saw from the outside. And You know, in Paris, the Van Doesburgs had quite a lot of quite successful artist and musician friends. So I'll give you a few examples. They were friends with Marcel Duchamp, who would often come to the studio on the Rue du Moulin Vert and play chess with Van Doesburg. They were in the same social circle as the composer Erik Satie. And you know, this dapper lad that you can see at the front of the photograph with a cigarette, this is E.L.T. Masons. He was a protege of Erik Satie. And they were also, you know, they visited the studio of Constantin Brancusi, the sculptor, who had contributed to Stijl. Now, the reason I mention all of these people is because, you know, they had in common a mutual friend, a writer from Twickenham named Sybil Harris, who was renting this studio for an impoverished artist friend named Harry Phelan Gibb. And so Van Doesburgs really kind of fell on their feet, knowing the right people. You know, I don't know exactly how it happened, but in the middle of, you know, a huge studio crisis in Paris, within a couple of days, they'd managed to find, you know, not only a studio, but a furnished studio that they could keep for exactly the time period that they wanted. You know, you have to think that actually Paris 100 years ago was actually, you know, the population of the city was actually, you know, 1 million people more than it is today. I think that's something like, you know, I can't do the maths, but it's something like 28,000 people per square kilometer of the city. And, you know, this including, you know, all of the artists of Europe who are all descending on the same neighborhood, trying to get the same studios. You know, people would live in hotels for months on end. But as I said, the Van Doesburgs were lucky enough to find a studio straight away. And this is what it looked like on the inside. So this is actually the original, or half of the original studio of the complex. It was built in 1867. And, you know, it had no electricity. This is gas lamps hanging from the ceiling and an iron stove in the center here. Although, you know, that wasn't a concern for the Van Doesburgs, because 1923, the summer where they were staying, was actually, you know, the hottest summer ever recorded in France, I think. And these studio skylights actually turned the whole place into a greenhouse. So there was no problem about heating at all. But here is what Theo van Doesburg thought about his studio. So he said, "My studio is really beautiful. From the outside, it's a bit old and neglected. You should look at Paris through French and not Dutch eyes." I agree with that. On the inside, it's solid, spacious, and light. So, you know, this was the studio where they would spend all of their time from April until mid-October when the exhibition happened. And they would plan the whole exhibition, you know, from scratch at 51 Rue du Moulin Vert. And here you have some photographs of Van Doesburg with a young architect whose name is Cornelis van Eesteren. And it was him who sort of helped him put in, it was Van Eesteren who sort of did the architectural work, you know. Van Doesburg had no formal architectural training. For the most part, you know, he was theorizing and doing the color palettes for the designs. And Nelly also sort of took on an advisory role for the exhibition. So she says that Theo and Van Eesteren worked night and day preparing the exhibition, and they woke me every night at around 3 or 4 in the morning to show me how far they'd got and to have coffee with them. So, you know, Van Doesburg and Van Eesteren would sleep in very late, having worked the whole night through. And Nelly would sort of creep out in the morning to see the city or to go and rehearse the piano. So as well as being a painter and a dancer, Nelly was a pianist. And during her time at 51 Rue du Moulin Vert, she had, you know, a series of almost comically illustrious mentors for her piano career. So she was taught by the pianists Alfred Cortot and Alexander Borowski. She also went to play, because there was obviously no piano at the complex, so she went to play the piano of the famous modernist composer Arthur Honegger, and also she played concerts with Erik Satie, whose name I also mentioned. So she played, well, Nelly Van Dusberg played a couple of concerts with Erik Satie in 1923, the most notable of which was at an event called the Soirée du Cœur à Barbe, which was a Dadaist evening, which was arranged by a group of Russian artists called the Cherez Group. And it was sort of, you know, films, a play, but also music, everything at the same time. And all of the celebrities of Paris were supposed to attend. And Erik Satie arranged the musical program and invited Nelly to join. So you can see, you know, halfway down, there's the announcement of Erik Satie playing a duet with Marcel Meyer. And then directly underneath, you can maybe just about make out the name Theo van Doesburg, which was Nelly's stage name for when she was playing the piano. Now, the Soirée du Cœur à Barbe is actually a very well-known event in art history, and it's known as being as one of the most spectacular failures and significant failures, let's say, of all time, because it was deliberately sabotaged by the nascent surrealist group who didn't particularly like the Dadaists anymore. So you know, fighting broke out, you know, before Nelly even had the chance to start playing. And, you know, Theo van Doesburg, who quite enjoyed conflict, was watching gleefully from the sidelines. And this is how he describes what happened. So he says, the Dadaists in the audience elbowed their way to the Dadaists on the stage. A general panic broke out. There was now fighting throughout the theatre. Assassins, roared an older gentleman as he nervously put his glasses away. So actually, you know, there was proper fighting and heckling and shouting all the way through the performance. Nobody was actually able to enjoy it. One person at least left with a broken arm. The theatre was completely destroyed. The police were called. But you know, the Dadaist movement, which had been so successful and so influential in the years during and just after the war, the press almost the following day declared was completely dead because of this evening. And I find it quite interesting that this couple, you know, were there front and center and saw this significant moment in art history. So onto the exhibition at the Galerie de l'Effort Moderne. So I'll show you some of the designs which Cornelis van Eesteren and Theo van Doesburg made together. So I think the first thing that you notice is that they're done using these very recognizable de Stijl primary colors. But when you look a little closer, I mean, they seem to be buildings designed by people who have never seen a building before, let's say, or, you know, people who don't understand what the constituent parts of a building are supposed to be. So, you know, you would think that if you were designing an artist studio or a house, as they were doing, your starting point is you have some form of box, and then you put in walls to make rooms and make smaller boxes and that kind of thing. These designs show the two artists and architects deliberately sidestepping that. So, you know, it seems that there's ambiguity in lots of places over which parts are outside and which are inside. And instead of having, you know, walls making rooms as you would expect, you have these kind of floating planes which intersect with each other in strange and unusual ways. And that was actually a very deliberate choice of Van Doesburg and Van Eesteren. You know, they didn't just want to create an architecture which was in the style of the neoplasticist movement that they were part of. They wanted to create a new architecture for the world after the First World War. You know, this was the art of de Stijl, and I think we could imagine that when they opened this exhibition, they weren't just hoping to, show people some nice buildings. They really had the idea that they might change society with them. So here is the exhibition when it actually happened. It all fell together very much at the last moment, with Van Doesburg apparently quite annoying Rosenberg with how slapdash everything turned out to be. And this is what Nelly remembers about it. So she says, Van Doesburg, Van Eestere and I had put all our hopes into the De Stijl exhibition. When it finally opened, my husband and Van Eestere were almost dead from exhaustion. It was a great moral success, but alas, no material reward followed. So, Rosenberg was quick to reassure them that, Paris isn't won over in a day. But whereas they might have wanted to quickly make a name for themselves on the Parisian art scene, it would take, several decades to achieve the prominence that they would come to know. Now, a couple of months before the opening of the exhibition, some friends of the Van Doesbergs arrived in Paris. And they are our next couple who lived at 51 rue Hippolyte, and their names were Ivan Pooney and Cassenia Bogustavskaya. And wherever they went, they were sort of known as this sort of, inseparable power couple who put on these wild, really eye-catching exhibitions and through quite drunken studio parties, let's say, reuniting all of the most important members of the Russian, the French, and the German avant-garde. They were also, let's say, the subject of a lot of gossip, in the fact that they had quite open extramarital affairs, both of them with other women, without, seeming to be that concerned about hiding it at all. But on the subject of these studio parties, actually, Nelly Van Dusberg, from her time in Berlin, one of her fondest memories, she said, was the bohemian studio of Ivan Pooney. And she said that at Pooney's studio, we drank our alcohol neat, and Ivan's wife, Cassenia Bogustavskaya, poured the vodka with as much abundance as grace. So actually, when you look at these two couples, you can think that their stories are actually very similar. So they both came to Paris from Berlin in 1923, largely for the same reasons as well, both for a love of the city, but also because of, spiraling inflation in Germany, making the quality of life, the costs in life too high. Ivan Pooney was also a contributor to the Stijl. They had the same friends, they hang around the same people, the same art movements and this sort of thing, both inspired by Dadaism and Futurism. But the beginning of their journey to Paris was actually very different. So the Pooney couple, they were avant-gardists before the revolution. Okay, so this is a very famous exhibition that they put on with Tatlin and Malevich. They actually organized it. It was called the Last Futurist exhibition. Malevich is the guy sitting here next to Bogustavskaya. And actually, this was a very dangerous thing to do if you think about it. So, being an avant-gardist in the time of Tsarist Russia, openly saying you're trying to break apart society and change society, and being allied with leftists and this sort of thing, you could get thrown in prison, but you could get sent to Siberia quite easily. And in fact, this review that I'm showing you is a collection put together by Bogustavskaya, which was confiscated in the end on the grounds of obscenity. Now, after the revolution came, they saw a danger of a very different kind. So they were invited by their friend Chagall, the well-known painter Marc Chagall, to the People's Art School in Vitebsk, which had been asked to run. And to begin with, this was a very enjoyable experience, but things quickly degenerated. So Bogustavskaya said that, you know, the people's commissars who were in charge of keeping order, they were, you know, basically just kids. They were college age, you know, guys who would come and drink with them and sing Russian folk songs around the fire and that sort of thing. But then, you know, the next day you would hear a story about one of them had put a, you know, made a minor infringement of the rules and had been shot dead on the spot. And actually, one day the Pooneys were leaving their studio and they were told that there was a corpse lying in front of the door. And with this situation being as it was, they decided that the only thing that they could do was flee the country. And this they did in the depths of winter 1919, crossing the frozen sea near Finland on foot. So this is how Bogustavskaya remembers this journey. So she said that Pooney's father owned a large property on the Finnish-Russian border, right at the end of the Gulf of Finland, in the part known as the Fox Snout. We left saying we were going there on holiday, and one night, hiding under a white sheet so as not to stand out against the snow, the Red Guards shot at anything that moved. We crossed the Gulf with snow up to our chests. So after this long and perilous journey, they ended up in Berlin. And then finally, because it was always the idea that they wanted to end up back in France where they'd lived before, at the end of August 1923, they arrived in Paris. And, you know, almost certainly through their contacts with the Van Dusbergs, they are, you know, at the beginning of 1924, the 1st of January, they moved into the studio next door at 51 rue du Moulin Vert. So I showed you that this studio with the door open and upstairs was the studio where Theo and Nelly Van Dusberg lived. The studio downstairs on the left with the double doors that you can just about see in the corner, that's where Cassenia, Bogustavskaya and even Pooney ended up living. Now I found a memoir from a woman who had an affair with Ivan Pooney at this time, a woman called Lyudmila Miklashevskaya. And she describes the studio in this way. So she calls Ivan Pooney Vanya, if you want to, you know, it's not a different person. So Vanya's studio was far away on the outskirts of Paris. It was a rather large barn, the walls covered in plaster, but very unsightly. The entrance from the street led straight into the room without a single step up. The whole place was a phenomenal shambles, and only Pooney's magnificent paintings hanging on the walls ennobled this mess. So I can show you what this building looks like today. This is why I showed you the old-fashioned photographs first, because actually it's changed quite a little bit. So in the 30s, a whole extra floor was added on the top, and another studio next door to it was built. You can see that both the Van Dusberg studio and the Pooney studio, you could still visit them today. In spite of that, they're still there. Now, in these early days in Paris, Bogustavskaya basically kept the Pooney household afloat. So, as well as through her usual job of organizing studio parties and keeping both the conversation and the alcohol flowing, she found jobs not only for herself and for Pooney, but also for all of Pooney's Russian friends who had just moved to the city as well, you know, in commercial work, doing stage and set designs for, you know, the Folies Bergère and the Bataclan Theatre. But she also started her own business selling textiles. And I mentioned Lyudmila Miklashevskaya, the woman who Pooney had an affair with. She also employed her in her business. So she was very business-minded, let's say. As for Pooney, he exhibited in cafes with the Cherez group. So the Cherez group are the group of Russians who organized the ill-fated Soirée du Cœur à Barbe, which I mentioned earlier, which got trashed by the Surrealists. And this is a little advert for a night which was put on with Pooney's paintings. You'll have to take my word for it, but this says Cherez, and underneath you can see that Pooney was was exhibiting alongside Bartsch, Tereshkovich, Kremen, Lanskoy, and Granovsky. And actually, these were the names that he really became associated with in Paris. Not only these names, but also Chagall, who, as I mentioned, was already a friend, Soutine, who he really didn't like, but whose painting he admired, and also Osip Zadkin. These were sort of a group of Russian artists who would, in cafes, exhibit together around this time. But like the Van Doesburgs, the Pooney's time at the studio complex was really taken over with this idea of putting on one big exhibition which would launch them to the Parisian public. So at the bottom of this slide, you can see an advert for this exhibition which took place in April 1925 at the Barbazange Gallery, which, just as an aside, Bror Hjorth mentions obliquely in his autobiography. I have absolutely no proof of this at all, but I really like the idea that he might have walked past and seen this exhibition. It was a place, he said, that you could see the modern masters. And you can notice from this advert, in fact, that from the time that he arrived in Paris, Ivan Pooney Gallicized his name to become Jean Pooney. Now here's another quotation from Mythology's memoirs. So she says that Cassenia believed in Vanya's talent, was proud of him, and bent over backwards for him. At the same time, she found patrons, brought them to the studio, handled critics, negotiated with art dealers. She came home tired but smiling, covered the table with bags of sausages, fruits, cheeses, sardines, and showered Vanya with stories about good forecasts for the exhibition. So, you know, it was something that everybody who spent time with the Pooney couple noticed. Bogustavskaya was really this tireless promoter of her husband's work. So as well as providing paintings for the exhibitions, she did some sort of Cubo-futurist watercolors. You know, she promoted it. She contacted all of the most respected periodicals of the day and got articles inserted in them. She got in touch with reviewers who, before they'd even seen the exhibition, wanted to write reviews of Pooney's work. And just before I move on, I'll show you some of those paintings which Pooney did for the exhibition. So, what I actually quite like about these, but completely outside of their artistic merit or anything like that, is that you can really see the life of the studio through these paintings, if you're looking closely. So you can see all of this clutter that Mythologyskaya talks about that made the studio such a mess. These items that must have been bought at flea markets and elsewhere. The musical instruments that Pooney inherited from his musical father and grandfather. But also the people who passed through the studio. So Mythologyskaya posed for some of these paintings, and also you can see this one on the right. This is Cassenia Bogustavskaya's nephew, who worked as a laborer in Paris and posed as a strongman for one of Pooney's paintings. And just a really perhaps uninteresting detail for anyone except for me, you might think that this strange color that you see on the walls is a stylistic choice, but this was actually the trademark Pooney pink, which he was very proud of having painted on the actual walls of 51 rue Hippolyte there. So this was a mix of yellow ochre, vermilion, and white, which he painted his studio in Berlin as well. So there we are. So that is all of the studios. Well, not all of them, but this is the studios at 51 rue Hippolyte. So those are the ones that in this photograph of the studios that you see today. The ones on the very far right of the photograph on the first two floors, and you can see from the floor plan of how the studio looked at the time that Bror Hjorth was there. It's sort of the studio sort of stretched towards the wall in the form of the house, and then back again in this inverted L shape towards the road at the rue Hippolyte Maindron. And this little patch here is the narrow passageway that we saw in the photographs of Giacometti at the beginning. And so this leads on to the artists of the rue Hippolyte Maindron, and in particular, Bror Hjorth. Now, at the beginning, Matthias explained a little bit about Hjorth's time in Paris. And I imagine that of people watching, you'll probably be aware of Hjorth's career, but I'll just summarize a few details about his early life. So, he was a painter and a sculptor. And in the autumn of 1914, he came down with quite a nasty cold, which after visiting the doctors, he was told was actually tuberculosis. And he spent, one acquaintance said, the time after this he spent basically wandering the woods on his own, not really being anything at all. He had years of cures, which I imagine must have been quite lonely. But in 1921, he had this sort of second adolescence in Paris. And having gone through the same nightmare as so many other artists of trying to find a studio, he lived in several different hotels. He sublet from friends who were going back to Sweden. He lived outside in the suburbs for a little while. In 1923, he found finally a studio at 46 rue Hippolyte Maindron. And he's standing just outside it in this photograph here with his black cat Salamo, or Salomon, I think we say in English. So, here is the narrow passageway. And Bror Hjorth's studio was this one right at the very end next to the staircase with the windows that you can see just here. So Giacometti's was right at the front, and Bror Hjorth's was right at the back just here. And there aren't many photographs of the studio itself from the time that Hjorth was there, but I did manage to find the memoirs of another artist who took over the studio after Hjorth had left. So this handsome chap in this photograph, this is the Swedish sculptor Gunnar Nilsson, and he lived in Bror Hjorth's studio from around 1929. And these are photographs of the studio as it was then. So the way he describes it, he says, this studio where Bror Hjorth had lived seemed more like a cellar than a studio. The window looked out over the courtyard of school where the children made a huge racket at playtimes. No water or gas, a lamp hanging from the ceiling, and the passageway outside was a pump where I washed myself in the morning. So this was, a timber-framed studio with only the bare earth as a floor. It was built in May of 1916 by the landlord Pierre-Ernest de Charéron, at the same time as he remodeled some already existing studios, which would become Giacometti's studio. As Gunnar Nilsson mentions, there was no electricity or running water, or there was no running water inside the studio itself. So if you wanted to have a wash, this would involve going to the communal tap, which was shared with all of the other artists. And you can see that the studio was heated by this little coal stove, which in the uninsulated studio, it would be completely boiling the moment you put this stove on, and then the moment you stop putting on fresh coals, it would be completely freezing again. And for lighting, there was gas lamps hanging from the ceiling. This kind of mixture, this health and safety nightmare is the kind of thing that I think art students in the 1920s must have just been okay with, I don't know. But I did find one final photograph of this studio, which is taken in 1961. So this is Giacometti with the playwright Samuel Beckett in Bror Hjorth's old studio at the complex. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that gradually Giacometti would end up not only renting his own iconic studio, but lots of others in the studio complex. So the school, which Gunnar Nilsson mentions being so disturbing at playtimes, eventually expanded. And they built a new school building right up against the walls of the studio, blocking the windows. So it became completely uninhabitable. And Giacometti decided to use it as a storeroom. Now, I'll show you some of the art which Hjorth created at 46 rue Hippolyte Maindron. So this is where he developed his sort of quite faux naive, Swedish folk painting, let's say. And this large photograph is perhaps not my favorite in terms of the way it looks, but it's a photograph which Matthias from the Bror Hjorth Museum sent me for a reason which I will explain. And that is that there's possibly an interesting story which links this bust to Hjorth's painting style. So in Bror Hjorth's autobiography, he talks about having had a friend who was terrible at painting, who he shared a studio with. And when asked Hjorth's opinion on his painting, Hjorth responded that it needed more life and consistency. And this friend was very sort of insulted by this comment and asked Hjorth to correct the painting. And Hjorth decided that this wasn't the thing to do, to paint on somebody else's painting, and so decided to create a whole new painting of his own to demonstrate how he thought, painting should be done. And this is the story that he tells to introduce his style. And the reason that I mention this is that this is actually a bust carried out in 1923 of the artist Arvid Jorn, which I said, as I mentioned, Matthias sent to me as a possible suggestion of who this anecdote might have been about. So this is the bust of Jorn, and you can see from this Salon catalogue entry that he shared a studio with Hjorth at the rue Hippolyte Maindron. And another sort of piece of the puzzle which might slip into place is this painting just here, which was painted in 1923 and given by Hjorth as a gift to Jorn. So I can't say anything for certain, but you could possibly imagine that this might be the painting which is mentioned in Hjorth's autobiography. But in any case, back to the studio. Hjorth actually did share this studio with successive Swedish artists. So here you have the sculptor Bertil Sander, and this is the census for Paris from 1926, the last year that Hjorth was there. And you can see, I don't know if I should even try and pronounce this Swedish name, but let's give it a go. I'll say Torild Plinning. Can I have a thumbs up? Yes, okay. So Torild Plinning and Bror Hjorth, and these are the two artists who you can see in the studio at the rue Hippolyte Maindron with Salamo the cat, who lived together over 1925, 1926. So, having shown you this photograph of the passageway, you could imagine that there were artists living in every single one of these tiny little studios, and I won't go through all of them, but I will just, show you them by face and by name. So, these were the people who Hjorth will have seen every day of his life, at his time on the rue Hippolyte Maindron, with the exception of the poet Gabriel Belot, or the poet and printmaker Gabriel Belot, who left a few months earlier. All of them were there for his entire stay. And I'd like to sort of finish by talking about Jean Fautrier, the artist who I mentioned is named in Hjorth's own writings. So I can't exactly find a very polite way of saying this, but this is a photograph of Fautrier from around 1920, to 1923, which is the time when he moved in to his studio on the rue Hippolyte. And he looks sort of quite sickly and almost vampiric in complexion, let's say. And this was something that people noticed about him. So, one patron who met him this same year saw him at an exhibition dressed head to toe in grey like a Dominican priest. And, was so convinced that, he was so pale that he must be anemic, that she just walked over to him and said, okay, I prescribe you a dose of cod liver oil, this will sort out everything. But, like Hjorth's illness, Fautrier, his troubles went a little bit deeper. So he was drafted in the last year, well, in 1917, and was wounded, and then afterwards suffered a gas attack outside Montdidier in the north of France. And because of his injuries, he was demobilized. And, he suffered, damage to his eyes, which was quite horrific for an artist, but also, quite debilitating pleurisy to his lungs. And this was a disability which stayed with him for, the rest of his life. But because of this, he received a pension from the French state in 1923 of, around 850 francs, which helped him pay the rent at the rue Hippolyte at a time when he was not necessarily selling many paintings. So this is his studio that you can see. It was, at the top of the staircase above Bror Hjorth's studio. And here is a self-portrait from this time that he created. Now, he wasn't alone in this little painter's studio, because actually the woman who had nursed him back to health, the hospital worker, after this gas attack, was a woman named André Pierson. And Fautrier and Pierson had developed a relationship, and she lived with him for this entire time from 1923 to 1926, when he was living above Bror Hjorth at the rue Hippolyte Maindron. And, partway through this stay, she worked as a model for various artists, for the painter Marcel Gromer, but also for Fautrier himself. So in 1925, Fautrier begins to do nude studies using his girlfriend André as a model. So these are the ones that you can see just here, in the studio of the rue Hippolyte Maindron, which you can see in the background of the paintings. And it's actually just struck me that this is actually quite a good demonstration of how you get a proper bath if you live in a cold studio without running water or electricity. It involves a tin bath and a coal stove. So actually, the way that Fautrier felt about this period in his career, well, he describes it in this way. He said he worked very laboriously, relentlessly, forced to take on other jobs of the most diverse and surprising kinds to cover my few expenses. I was no longer selling anything. Finally, in 1924 or 1925, when I did a painting in the new French pot boiler style, dealers were tripping over themselves trying to get hold of me. And for a few years, I was able to continue my journey. So Fautrier was quite a gloomy character in many ways, and he seems to be quite disparaging about these early paintings, which, more recently have achieved some kind of critical success. But I wanted to sort of show you this to show you, a big contrast between the way that Fautrier saw his time at the rue Hippolyte Maindron and the way that Bror Hjorth himself saw his time on the rue Hippolyte. And it's with this quote from Hjorth's autobiography on that time that I would like to finish this talk. So he says, so much happened to me in those years in terms of artistic experience, of fruitful, I will start again. So much happened to me in those years in terms of artistic experiences, of fruitful reflections on art. It was during these first years in Paris that I lived, that I was free, when I did not have to exhibit and was completely set on learning. I had a good time in my little studio on the rue Hippolyte, where Fautrier ran up the stairs, or rather wooden steps, which stood in the middle of the narrow passageway and led up to his studio on the first floor above mine. And where after I left, Giacometti had, for many years, 2 small studios facing the street. With my black Angora cat, Solomon, with his glowing eyes, I lived half on earth, half in heaven and in dreams. So there you are. This was my talk on the studio complex of the rue Hippolyte Maindron and the rue du Moulin Vert. And I think, Matthias, if you want to join again, I think you said there might be some questions.
There's been no questions on YouTube so far, but we haven't gotten to the end of the talk. So if you want to ask James a question, please post it on YouTube. And we have Bertil here on Zoom. If you want to ask something, feel free.
I hear silence. I'm going to go and turn the light on.
So I thought it was a fantastic lecture, very, very inspiring.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I really, really liked it. And I got this text from my wife, and she said that this is fantastic. What book should you and I write?
Should you and I already? What book do you think you're going to write together?
I don't know, but we have to go to Paris as well, I guess.
Yes.
Another studio complex and write. It's so amazing with someone who is so knowledgeable, and you really know your subject, and it's been a pleasure, the email correspondence I have had with you. I've learned a lot, and you've sent some fantastic material to us here at the Bror Hjorth's house, which we are very grateful for.
Yes, it's been fantastic. Thank you for inviting me to come and talk. It's been interesting to think about how to put all of this together.
We have a question. Where did you find all the archives? And that's a question I have as well. I'm really impressed by your. You found things like in archives in Sweden that I did not even know about.
What did I find in Sweden that you didn't know?
No, but like things written on the back of paintings. I think it's truly amazing.
Let's see. Where did I find the archives? I mean, I was very lucky, I think, in that I moved from Paris to the Netherlands, just before this horrible event that we're all living through started, the pandemic, I should say. And it was sort of a nice coincidence with the Van Dusbergs, who were obviously living in this studio complex. Their archives are, within cycling distance of my house. So I was very lucky to be able to see, some archives which are quite obscure, but which I managed to have very easy access to, thankfully. It's actually quite a difficult question because it's all come from so many different places. For example, the book which gives first-hand testimony of Pooney and Bogustavskaya's time on the rue du Moulin Vert. I can't remember exactly how I found it, but it's a book in Russian that has gone out of print and it has never been translated into English. So I think in some respects, I've just been very lucky, and in others, I'm just weirdly obsessive about finding information and have somehow managed to stumble across the right stuff. I'm not sure if that completely answers the question.
I think it says a lot that you wanted me to, or you ordered before I sent you Bror Hjorth's autobiography. You actually ordered it and it's in Swedish, and I guess you don't speak Swedish, so
I don't speak Swedish, no.
so you ordered it and then wanted to translate it yourself. I think that's fantastic. So
yeah, I have my copy right here in front of me.
yeah.
It's a bit beside the topic today, but have you any comment on how they influenced each other, being in a sort of more collective area? They all developed very differently, didn't they?
Yes, absolutely. That's a really interesting question, actually. And I think it was when I started doing this research, that was the main question that I wanted to find the answer to. And I think in some ways it's a very difficult question to find a satisfactory answer about, because, if you're talking about, things which happened 100 years ago, your best source of information is going to be letters, rather than memoirs which are written afterwards. And you don't write letters to the people that you live with, so finding out this kind of thing is quite difficult.
Okay.
And in actually tracing, rather than this person being influenced by this particular art movement, being influenced by this particular person, that's a lot more difficult to say. But in the cases that I mentioned today, I didn't necessarily find anything except for the Pooney Van Dusberg link, which actually goes in the opposite direction. To begin with, they were very influenced. Well, Van Dusberg was influenced by Pooney and Pooney's avant-garde associates, but then they ended up pushing in quite opposite directions and had, I think, arguments over art. But there are certainly cases where artists work together. So, for example, there was a Danish artist called Sonja Ferlo, who lived in the studio complex from the late 30s and from the mid 30s, sorry. And she befriended Giacometti, and you can see the visible influence of Giacometti's work in her sculptures. Okay. And also, he taught her particular techniques in sculpture. So yeah, there were certainly occasions where I felt I didn't find the answer that I wanted. It's very difficult to trace who's influenced by whom, but there are also lots of little stories like that where you hear, artists living in this quite collective way and, sharing techniques, sharing ideas, and sharing influence between each other. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think also it's so inspiring to think about this milieu and this environment in the Paris 1920s, and sort of, for me, working in this museum dedicated to Bror Hjorth's work, to really, as you did today, put him inside a living art history with all those characters surrounding him, all the other artists, all the people that he must have met, even though his hearing impairment due to the tuberculosis made him perhaps not the most social man. Kept mostly to himself and not big companies. I guess he wouldn't have liked the studio parties next door, but probably all the rackets from the school children. So I must have...
There was one thought that I did have, that Hjorth, I think, inherited his father's violin, just like Pooney did as well. I have this. I know it almost definitely didn't happen, but I have this daydream of them playing the violin together.
It's, as I said, it's been really a lot of fun, a real treat, this lecture, and you made me want to go back to Paris and also to dig deeper into Bror Hjorth's time there. And as I said before we end this live stream, I would like to express my gratitude for all the material information you sent us during your research. And if you find anything else, please send it to us.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I know this was only a small period in time during this studio complex whole life. As you have shown, there are still studios there today. I don't know if any artists are living there, but
there are still artists living there. Yes, absolutely. In fact, there is one artist who was a friend of Giacometti's in the 50s, and she's still living there. So there we are.
Yeah. So thank you so much for this lecture. You will now become a member of the Bror Hjorth Friends Association. And I hope that we get past this pandemic and that you can travel again. And we will happily welcome you to Bror Hjorth's Hus in Uppsala and give you a tour of the museum.
I'm really, really looking forward to it. And thank you, Matthias, for all of your help. You know, you've answered my 1,000 questions via email, and it's been a great help. And it's been fantastic to see the photos that you've sent me as well. So thanks for everything, and thank you for inviting me this evening.
Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye-bye.